Joining us right here on the Rich Eisen Show is a dear friend back here on the program, Sports Illustrated's own Albert Breer. Good to see you, Albert. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How you doing,
I'm
Rich?
great. Everything good in your neighborhood right here?
Everything's great. We got college football this weekend, right?
That's right.
I can't believe how close it is. It's like my camp trip is done
They're done.
now, and less than 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
Till Ravens Chiefs. I think 2 weeks from like now, right, is going to be Eagles Packers in Brazil,
Are you going to
which
be
is hard to
Are
believe.
you going to be at the kickoff? You going to KC?
I'm not positive on that yet.
Okay.
Still TBD,
Okay.
but I will be watching, of course, either way.
Well, we're bringing the show there. The only reason why I
Oh,
ask
you
is,
are?
yeah, so if you're
Okay.
going to be there, obviously you got a spot on our show, and I just want to see you in person
Yep.
to see how long does the training camp tan last? How
Is
long
this
does
still
it?
here? I think it's fading a little bit,
Oh,
don't
no,
you?
no, no,
No?
no, no, not at all.
No.
I could see that. Although I don't
Okay.
know, it matches all the scarlet behind you, so I think
Yeah.
kind of clashes with the
I'm
scarlet.
not that red. I'm not that red, but I had yeah, no, I cheated a little bit this year too with my 9-year-old's football practices have gotten me outside a bunch
There
too
you
when I'm
go.
not on the road. So
Fantastic.
still I hopefully I can hold on to this for a little while longer.
Still, you've got the youthful glow, so soon you'll have the scarlet and then the gray on top of your hair. You'll
Yeah.
get the full whole thing. So, but you were at Jets training camp this week,
Yep, on
correct? That was your
Monday.
last one. That was your last sort of check-in
It
visit.
was it was one of my it was the last swing. So I did Jets Monday, Giants Tuesday, and then I was with the Bucks and Dolphins. They practiced together on Wednesday.
All right, so let's take them in order. What'd you glean from the Jets, Albert?
Yeah, a couple things. Number one, it's interesting. The first thing that everybody I talked to brought up was the offensive line and how good the offensive line looks, which to me is just about as important as anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're going to have Quinn Williams on in your next segment, right? It'd be interesting to hear from him about what he's noticed because he had to go up against those guys
Yep.
in practice day to day. They have like what they view as three starting tackles in Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, and Olu Fashanu, who's been great and could start at left tackle today if they needed him to. And then two backups that played a lot last year. So they feel like they've got five legitimate NFL tackles, which is way better than it was last year. And then the interior of their line, Joe Tippmann in his second year, and then Oliveira Tucker and John Simpson coming over from the Ravens. So I think like the fact that they've overinvested in the offensive line has certainly paid dividends. And going up against a defensive line that has, and this I'm not misspeaking here, seven former first round picks on it, it really has created an ideal situation in camp for them. So I don't want to get you too excited here. I kind of got the feel going there that they're where the Bucks were when they got Brady. Like that's sort of where the roster is. Like it's ready to go, and it doesn't need a quarterback to be a superhero. So Aaron Rodgers won't need to be a superhero for them to compete week to week, which is ideal, for any quarterback. And then I got a lot of time on Monday. I got a bunch of time with Aaron Rodgers. And I will just say this, like I think he is more appreciative of the chance to play football. And he and I had a really interesting conversation about how there was a point in his life when he was really kind of caught up in trying to prove to everybody that his life is more than just football and that he's not just a football player. And, it was just interesting talking to a guy at 40 years old who obviously the end is much closer than the beginning. Talk about how much he's appreciated about every bit of the process coming off of the Achilles and how he really wants to relish what he's got here and how cool it is to be a football player. Not that he's not more than a football player, but just how cool it is to be a football player. So it just seems like he's in a really good spot, Rich. And just talking to people there and based on the improvements they made on the offensive line, I'd be surprised if he doesn't kill it this year.
So, how did you glean that, though? I mean, what are you willing to share with all of us here, Albert, for you to come away to say that he's more appreciative of being a football player than, say, the last couple of years when he has been talking in many different media outlets, including our buddy McAfee, about things outside of football. What made you pick up on that? Did he literally
He
say
flat out
those
said
words
it.
to you? He
He
flat out.
flat out said it to me. Yeah. Like, I mean,
Okay.
I think that there's just like going through what he went through. Obviously, age is part of that too, but like going through what he went through, and having it taken away from you. And when you're around the team, and I'm sure you've heard pro athletes say this, I certainly have over the course of my career covering them, Rich, like that. You just like for an athlete, when you're hurt and you can't do anything to help the team, you almost feel like this, even if you're around them, this disconnection, that there's nothing you can do about. And I just think it's all of that really has made him appreciate what's in front of him and appreciate the shot that he's got in front of him to go and win a Super Bowl and go and do something that no one's done, for that franchise in half a century. And then, the guys that he has around him too, and the team that he has around him and the shot that they all have collectively. I just, it was interesting because we had a part of our conversation. I had mentioned to him that like, what I had always heard about Tom and Brady, I think, Brady has sort of confirmed this to me in the past too. Like most guys don't fall out of love with Sunday, right? Like when they retire, they fall out of love with Monday through Saturday.
Yes,
They fall out of
indeed.
love. They fall out of love with having to run up a hill in March.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So like, I think the one thing that was interesting talking to Aaron about this was that he was like, I loved all of that this year. I loved getting ready for the season. I loved being around my teammates and OTAs. I loved training camp, even mundane as it can be. I loved every part of it. And not that he didn't always really like those parts, but I think that I don't know. And this part's my perception of it, but I do think like part of that appreciation again is just having it snatched away from you. And especially when a guy gets injured at that age, I think that I think that there's just like that mortality, that your football mortality slaps you in the face, right? Like you're not going to have this forever. And so, just having the ability to appreciate every part of it. He hasn't played in a game yet. He hasn't played in a regular season game since tearing his Achilles, but having a real appreciation, for every part of it. It was just really cool listening to him talk about that.
Sports Illustrated's Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. Okay, so then you saw the Giants as well, which means you were there just after Daniel Jones had his dreadful appearance. It wasn't all. I mean, listen, there's always ups and downs, but throwing that pick six, it was just wow. Like, is that what we're going to see from him this year? What did you glean from Dayball and the Giants when you saw them this week?
Well, first of all, no one sugarcoated that play. Like that play was not a good play. No one was saying that, like it was anything but what it looked like. So that's number one. I do think there's a couple things to consider with Daniel Jones, though. He's only 9 months post-op. And so like that's, like he's back, but like there's still some things that you're working through when you're at that point in the recovery. They say it takes a full year. So they're trying to accelerate him and ramp him up and get him ready for the season, but there's that part of it. And there's another part of it that I don't know that this has been out there quite as much, but I thought it was interesting too. And I think this is always interesting when you're talking about how to assess how guys are playing in training camp. Brian Daboll is trying to coach him to be more aggressive, and they want him to be more aggressive. And part of that is the presence of Malik Neighbors, in his receiver group now. But they want him to take chances. They want him to test himself. And if you're going to do that, right? Like if you're going to get yourself ready to play in the regular season that way, well, then you're going to have to live through mistakes in training camp. You're going to have to live through mistakes in preseason games. That's the only way you're going to figure out how to be more aggressive. So as they've really coached him on trying to become more aggressive, mistakes have come and a lot of good things have come too, and I think it's just sort of, that's part of the thing that like part of the problem I have with all these aggregation accounts on Twitter and everything else, Rich, is like they take single plays or a group of 3 plays and like act as if like the season's over or the season's made, right? And like the reality is we can't climb in every one of these guys' heads, and every one of these guys has different goals for training camp, Now with the guy who's trying to make the team, we know what he's trying to do, right? Like, so if you're a rookie or you're a third-year guy who someone's been drafted to replace you, like you don't have room to make mistakes. Like you have to put your best foot forward and it should look good every day. If you're a veteran and your coach is telling you, no, we want you to do this. It's like when I saw Brock Purdy, it was the same thing with him in San Francisco. He threw 4 picks the day I was there. And he explained to me after, he's like, I'm trying to test my limits. It's like, we don't know what the individual goals each of these guys have for every practice is. We don't know what the individual goals these guys have for the preseason games are, so a lot of times what you see on the surface isn't what it appears to be. And so, it takes talking to these guys and, like, I think that's really a huge part of our job is talking to these guys and figuring out what they're trying to accomplish. And there are times when they'll say, no, that was just stupid. I shouldn't have done that. But there are other times where it's like, I wanted to see if I could make that throw, you know? And it's a big part of training camp. And I know it's been part of Daniel Jones' training camp. Again, I'm not saying he's going to be all pro or anything like that, but you know, I think there is part of it that relates to the injury that's, you know, hampered his performance a little bit. And then there is, you know, an element of testing himself in different ways where I think you'll see some of the things that you saw in camp erased in that regard.
Daboll going to call the plays? Is he going to do it?
Yeah, it sounds like it. And
Okay.
I think, you know, what's interesting about that too is the primary area where they need a fix is the same as the Jets, right? It's the offensive line. Everybody saw that in the Hard Knocks series. And, you know, that's a big piece that was a big piece of their offseason, obviously, adding Greg Van Roten and Jermaine Illuminor and John Runyon to their offensive line, right? Like, and now we'll see what they can get out of Evan Neal. Well, another big piece of that was going and hiring Carmen Bracillo as their offensive line coach. And this isn't an under the radar hire, but it's an important one because Carmen Bracillo has New England background. He coached for Bill Belichick. He coached for Josh McDaniels in Vegas. His background is Brian Daboll's background. And so like they feel like they're going to be able to kind of streamline the offense a little bit and bring it back to what Brian Daboll knows best and what Brian Daboll has done best over the years. And that's always allowed Daboll to get the most out of the players that he's with. And so I'm interested to see how this whole thing comes together. But, you know, after a couple of years ago, we heard all about how like Daboll had gone outside his coaching tree to hire Mike Kafka, who's fantastic, and hire Wink Martindale and go all over the place to find all of these guys. You look at some of the hires he made this offseason, right?
Yes.
And they have similar background to him, right? Carmen Bracillo is one. Shane Bowen, their new defensive coordinator, is another. He came under Mike Vrabel, who, of course, is another guy with Patriot background. So it's sort of interesting that way and how they've set that up.
Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. You said you were at the Dolphins Bucks practices, joint practice together. Were you there when the Tua comments about Brian Flores came out?
A little bit after, yeah.
Okay, so what was the conversation about that then?
You know, I think it's just Tua. When I ask people about it, it's interesting. It's like that's Tua to a fault. Like he's just honest, and if you ask him, especially in a setting like that, like that Dan and the guys had him in, like you're going to get an honest answer. And I don't know how often he's been asked about Flores, you know, because they played so well the last couple of years, because he personally has done so well, and obviously has had some other things going on with the concussions and everything else. I don't know that anybody's really, you know, been diving into it the way that they did on the Levitard show. So, yeah, I think, you know, it's just sort of his honest truth. And what's really interesting about it to me is, you know, we talk about this stuff being generational and everything else. Do people forget what program Tua came from? Like
exactly.
Like
that's the whole thing. Like, you know, anybody who's sitting here saying he can't take tough coaching, it's just like, get out of here, you know? So
here's the thing.
But it's obvious that Flores never wanted him, right? I mean, like this now confirms it, right?
And I think that's part of the problem, right? Like, so part of the problem is like that, you know, Flo, and there was some disagreement, and obviously it was close on who they were picking there, Tua or Herbert. And, you know, I think some of this could be harboring some of that. I also think it's like part of it's like where Brian Flores had been and how he'd coached guys in the past and how he'd seen guys coach in the past. I mean, it's legendary the way Bill Belichick coached Tom Brady, right? And Belichick's philosophy had always been, you coach the best players the hardest, and then everybody else falls in line. It's just sort of the way it is. And so that's how Brian Flores coached Tua. I think one thing that's interesting though here, and this part is generational, is how I think Nick Saban doesn't get credit for tailoring his coaching to the individual players and what the individual players need. And I think the best guys do that. And I think that's one thing that Brian Flores has learned from going through this. And I think he's learned a lot from going through this, because he's always been a guy who's been loved by the players, like, right? Except for the Miami thing. Ask Devin McCourty about him. Ask Kyle Van Noy about him. Ask Dante Hightower about him. Ask the guys in Minnesota now, guys like Harrison Smith about him.
But
right?
defensive players are different than quarterbacks, man.
And that's the thing. And that's the lesson, right? Like, so that's the lesson. And here, I'll give you a really, really interesting story on CJ Stroud that I think explains this to a T, right? So, like last year, when the Texans were looking at who they were going to take second overall, Bobby Slowick, their offensive coordinator, got after CJ Stroud in the 30 visit pretty good. And CJ kind of shut down. And it was a way of testing him. And this happens a lot, right? Like, so he shut down. And I heard about that. And that's the reason why I didn't mock Stroud to the Texans. So then, afterwards, I circled back and I kind of dug in a little bit more and tried to figure out what happened. And as it turns out, D'Amico Ryans and Nick Caserio then went back to the people at Ohio State and asked them about CJ and said, well, this kid's been through a lot in his life. So he's not going to, react to, a football coach who he doesn't know, teaching him that, coaching him that intensely. You have to earn his trust. And not only did that get them to dig in more and wind up taking CJ Stroud, it also informed the way they coached CJ Stroud when they got him, So, and you think about that, right? Like how, what a great testament to the Texans organization that is that they set something up that didn't work for the player. They went and doubled back and checked into it again. And then like the lessons they learned not only wound up, putting them in position to draft the guy, but then, inform the way that they're teaching him going forward. I thought it was fascinating. And, I think that that's sort of the lesson you can learn from these situations is that, D'Amico and Bobby came from a very tough system in San Francisco. Kyle Shanahan coaches really hard, right? But you learn how to package it a little differently for every player. And I think that that's what's interesting about what Mike McDaniel is doing in Miami as well. And I know I'm being long-winded here, so I'm sorry about
it's
that.
just, Albert,
but I think that's what Mike McDaniel is demanding as hell as a coach. But he packages it a little differently for every player. And those players know he has their back, And so I think that that's probably a lesson that Flores takes from it. I think Flores is a fantastic coach. People forget his last, 2 years there, they won 19 games. That's one less than Mike McDaniel's won the last 2 years following Flores in Miami. So it's not like Flores wasn't a really good head coach. Like he did plenty of good there. But with maybe the most important relationship in the building, he failed. And, it's my feeling at least that he's learned a lot from it.
Yeah. These not these quarterbacks, and certainly this generation of players, there's an operation manual. And it seems like McDaniel had it better for Tua than Flores did. And clearly D'Amico Ryans and the rest of the Texans found the operation manual for CJ Stroud, and it led to a unicorn season. I mean, and I appreciate you lending that perspective. And the few minutes I have left with you, what is going on with these wide receiver contracts? And I imagine next week is the stroke of midnight here, right? You got to get these guys in a week from Monday. You got to get them. You got to get them in, right? I mean, you can't just sign them.
TJ, like, let's go over the last couple of years though. TJ Watt was what, the Saturday?
Correct, but our defense guys who go hunt are different than ones who need timing. One would think, right? And
I think TJ Watt and Nick Bosa were right before the season, but I get you. I get what you're saying. I think they'd like to get him in as soon as possible. Obviously, things have gotten really quiet on Brandon Aiyuk, and that to me is fascinating. That we've been through so much, and there was so much noise, and now things have been quiet for a while. Tells me that things are improving there. And I think as much as anything, this is about bridging the personal gap on some of the things that happened and some of the things on the way things were handled over the course of the last couple of months. I think John Lynch and Parag Marat and Kyle Shanahan deserve credit for handling this the way that they did, and that when the temperature got turned up, they sought closure on it, right? Like, so they basically said to Brandon Aiyuk, if you think you can find a better financial and football situation than we offer you, go get it. Like, let's see if you can find it. Goes to New England. The financial situation, they had 2 offers on the table for him, both of them over $30 million a year. Football situation wasn't nearly as good. He wasn't as interested. Wasn't real interested in going to Cleveland. Pittsburgh, he has a rapport with Mike Tomlin. The football situation is pretty good. The money wasn't much different than San Francisco's. So ultimately doing that pushed Aiyuk back to the table, and we'll see what happens. I think a key nuance to this one too, Rich, if they're going to pay Brock Purdy next year, who is the answer as a skill position player for the next 5 years? Debo's awfully beat up. Christian McCaffrey, I think you look at the mileage on his legs, he's been a unicorn as a football player and performing as much as he has with the workload he's taken on, but he's not forever either. And then George Kittle's in his 30s. So Ayuk is the guy you want to pair with Purdy long term. Lamb, I think, gets done because I think the Cowboys are getting closer to the neighborhood where this sort of thing needs to be. And Jefferson's obviously the standard now. The question is whether or not he's an outlier. And so, like that gap between what Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith and Nico Collins and Amon-Ra St. Brown got and Jefferson got, that's what has made this more difficult. So how close are you getting Lamb to Jefferson? And then that relates to Ja'Marr Chase too, where Chase and Jefferson obviously were in touch over the course of the offseason. So Chase knows exactly how things went with Minnesota and Jefferson, and he wants to be on that plateau. And I think for the Bengals, because things have been awfully quiet there hasn't been a lot of back and forth between the sides. I think for Chase, who has been professional through this whole thing, like the people there have told me he's been in meetings, he's helping the younger receivers, he's just not practicing. I think for Chase, it's all right, like, let's see if Jefferson's really the outlier. I actually think if Lamb gets close to what Jefferson got, that actually might push a deal over the goal line, because at that point the Bengals have nowhere to go. You know what I mean? There's no more argument left. Like, now there are two guys right up there, and you got to get a deal done, and it's going to be a lot more costly to do it 6 months from now. Remember too, the Bengals did Burrow right before the year last year. I think it was 2 or 3 days before the opener. So it's not like they haven't been down this road with a star player recently.
Right. And but he was going to be at least under contract and play. And the same thing with Dak this year. So that's the last one I have for you. That midnight can strike literally in a Cleveland hotel room the night before the season opener with Dak. Does that happen, do you think, Albert?
So the Cowboys have been principled on this one. And I think that there's this feeling of like, do we just have to leapfrog, everybody else? And, obviously the Joneses have the context of having done this for a long time. And you can remember, was this probably, almost 10 years ago now, where, Stafford, Carr, Garoppolo, Luck, like they all were leapfrogging each other. Matt Ryan was part of that, Aaron Rodgers at the end. So like, do you just leapfrog what the number that Burrow's at? What does the structure look like that? What does the guarantees look like that? Because, Burrow's deal is a stronger deal than Lawrence or Love. It's just, with the guarantees and structure, it's just a better deal, and it should be. He's been to a Super Bowl. So this one is, a little complicated that way. That said, I think if you look at the history of the Cowboys, there's like huffing and puffing all the way to the finish line, and then they wind up paying their guys at the top of the market. It's just true, right? It happened before with Dak. It happened with Zeke Elliott. It happened with Zach Martin. It's happened so many times. It might be happening with CeeDee Lamb now too, where they're going to wind up paying him way more than they wanted to. But it's just happened so many times. And I'm not sure that something will get done. Like I said, I think they're sort of in that like Rams in 2020 with Jared Goff thing, like where it's like, is this guy going to be, quite what we need to get us over the top? But do they have the stomach to see what's behind door number 2, where they go into the season with a quarterback in a contract year with it being like basically impossible to franchise tag him after this year. So he's got a free way to free agency. It's tough to actually go through with that. We'll see if the Cowboys have the stomach for it, if the negotiation isn't where they think it should be 2 weeks from now.
You're the man, Albert, as always. Thanks for making me smarter, and a great conversation. We'll chat soon, brother.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. Appreciate it.
That's Albert Breer, everybody. Soup to nuts right here on The Rich Eisen Show. Catch The Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.